Nonverbal communication basics. Have you ever thought about the first impression you give off when you enter a room? People often judge others on how they look or act before any words are ever exchanged. This happens because we use things like appearance and body language to form quick impressions. It's pretty fascinating how much we communicate even without saying a word. Nonverbal communication is basically any way that we send a message without using words. It can be intentional, like waving to say hello, or unintentional, like slouching, which may suggest you're bored or uncomfortable. It's interesting to note that some things we think of as nonverbal are actually specific cases of verbal communication. For example, using sign language like ASL involves using words in a different way through gestures instead of speech. If Tanya used ASL to sign taco, someone who knows ASL would understand her dinner preference. Since ASL has its own set of agreed upon symbols, it's considered a verbal language even though it is not spoken. On the other hand, if Tanya didn't know ASL, sign for taco, and just mimicked eating one or pointing across, that would be considered a nonverbal display. Scholars think our ability to communicate has this sort of way comes from a mix of culture or biology and is often just shaped by shared human experiences. In the early example with ASL, we saw how different gestures can represent the same thing, like a delicious food item. But what exactly makes one gesture verbal and another nonverbal? Especially when neither involves sound. To understand this better, let's look at some key characteristics of nonverbal communication. First off, nonverbal communication is everywhere. It's present in almost every interaction we have with others, whether it's the smile and the eye contact in a face to face conversation, the tone of our voice during a phone call, or even the use of emojis in text messages or emails. It's a big part of how we express ourselves without words. Another thing about nonverbal communication is that it's multi channeled. This means we can use different channels at the same time to send messages. We can use our facial expressions, the way we speak, the distance we keep from others, or eye contact, gestures, and even how we touch or don't touch someone to convey meaning. All of these different channels allow us to communicate complex ideas even without saying a word. When we receive nonverbal messages, our mind puts them together as sort of a jeslet in which means that we see them as a whole rather than sort of an individual or individual parts of something. This helps us understand that underlying messages behind the nonverbal cues. Interestingly, many people tend to believe nonverbal cues more than verbal ones, which shows how powerful nonverbal communication can be. So it's important to consider both verbal and nonverbal cues to fully understand a message. The reason that people view this as more of a sort of genuine thing is nonverbal. People view nonverbal cues as more genuine than verbal cues. And a lot of this has to do with the way that we are brought up. This could be from our past as children or something we've learned over time because lies are often verbal and not physically expressed. So people tend to rely on nonverbal communication like facial expressions, body language, tone of voice, and other nonverbal behaviors, all of which can convey emotion in attitudes as well as intentions. Verbal communication, on the other hand, can be very easily manipulated or misunderstood due to the facts such as sarcasm, being ambiguous, or differing cultures interpreting language differently. Additionally, nonverbal cues are often considered more instinctual and more primal, tapping into our subconscious understanding of human behavior. This can make them seem more authentic or trustworthy compared to our verbal messages, which may be seen as more deliberate or strategic. There are several types of nonverbal communication, each called a nonverbal code. Each through we often use these codes together. It's helpful to know the seven main ones individually. Number one is appearance. This is all about the message we send based on how we look, our clothing, our height, our eye color, and so on. It's a big part of making a first impression. The next is kinetics. This involves body movements like smiles, waves, and pointing. This is basically motion. There's also about behavior. So things like eye contact, like a glazed eye, or sort of how you come across as far as your verbal expressions. There's also the space around us, like personal space, how close we stand to others when it comes to proximity, which means the difference between things. And next is about touch, from a friendly hug to helping someone up the stairs or even more aggressive actions. The next involves how we use our voice, including volume, tone, pitch, pauses, and the meaning that we add to our words. The next are environmental features. This includes how the environment around us affects our communication, like the layout of a room or the objects within the room. When we meet someone new, we usually notice how they look before they ever say a word. This first impression can stick with us, even if it's not the whole picture of a person or who they are. Let's talk about what exactly we are basing this first impression on. First, clothing and artifacts. Our clothes say a lot about us, whether we mean it to or not. For example, a t-shirt with our school's name on it or our favorite sports team shows our interest in what group we belong to. Wearing professional clothing for a job interview shows that we're serious about the job. Even something like wrinkled clothes can give a cue that someone might have just woken up or perhaps rushed out of the house that day. That style, brand, or fit of clothing can also show which cultural or social group we're a part of. Artifacts are the items we carry or use that also say something about us, similar to clothing. So, for example, a politician might order a big cup of coffee from Dunkin' Donuts instead of their usual small espresso to seem more relatable. Or a new intern might borrow a fancy briefcase to make a good impression at their new job. Even a child might switch from childlike colorful pencils to a plain one to feel more grown up or sophisticated. We often use our clothes and things we carry to try to look more attractive or even to fit in better. But sometimes those efforts can backfire and send the wrong message. For example, in some cultures, everyone wears black to funerals, but in another culture, wearing bright colors might be a way to celebrate the deceased live. Height and body shape is another one. It's interesting how people can judge our personalities or how we communicate based on things we cannot change. For example, taller people are often seen as more assertive or leader-like. When it comes to their height, that's all that they were sort of judged on. Height is also valued in society that taller people often get treated better simply because they're taller. Body shape is another factor, but it might be a little bit more complex. Different cultures have different ideas about what body shape is attractive. In North America, for example, we look sort of for a athletic body with a V-shaped torso. This is often ideal for men, but puts pressure on men to try to look more like fit, like a Ken would be or a bodybuilder would be, even if it's not natural for their body type. There's also some cultures that value more round shapes with more body fat and are often stereotyped as lazy or unhealthy in the other culture, even though they could be perfectly healthy and perfectly fit with this rounder body type. You know those moments when you glance at someone and feel like you've figured them out in an instant? It's like a quick snapshot that gives you a sense of who they are. But other times, it takes more than just a quick look to really understand someone. You need more time to observe and interact with them to get the full picture. During this time, you start to notice their movements and gestures and try to make sense of what they're saying without words. Throughout history, people have used all sort of motions and gestures to get their message across. Some gestures are straightforward, like a referee signaling a touchdown with both arms up. Others add to a message, like mimicking a runner's arm movement to describe a fast marathoner, or using your thumb and forefinger close together to show something has a slim chance of happening. Because there are so many ways to use gestures, scholars have identified five main types. One is illustrators. These gestures go along with what we're saying and help illustrate our words. The next type of gesture has a very specific meaning, but they're not words. For example, if someone turns their head away and puts their head up to stop someone, hand up to stop someone, it's clear they're not interested. There's adapters. These gestures are more subconscious and show how someone is feeling inside. There are regulators. These gestures help maintain or manage a conversation. Like when someone finishes talking and turns to someone else, indicating it's their turn to speak. There is displays of emotion. I have these gestures like facial expressions, and they show how someone is feeling. When it comes to emotions, we humans might have a limited number of basic ones that we all understand. These are fear, happiness, anger, sadness, disgust, contempt, and surprise. By the way we express these emotions through our facial expressions, it's incredibly complex. We can intentionally make facial expressions to show how we feel, but we can also unintentionally show our true emotions through tiny split-second expressions called micro expressions. With about 20 muscles in our face, just for emotional expression alone, the possibilities are endless. Our eyes are powerful tools for communication, often saying more than our words ever could. Think about if Monica caught her fiance's attention from across the room with a flirtatious glaze, or maybe Tyrone knew he was in trouble as a kid when his mom gave him a specific look. We all have that, right? My mom has a look even to this day that when she makes that look, I know I've done or said something she didn't like. And this happens in everyday conversations as well. You can tell if someone is really listening, if they keep eye contact, or you can tell when a manager isn't key on your idea by a lack of interest in their eyes. Our eyes are powerful tools for communication, often saying more than our words ever could. And this happens again in everyday conversations. It happens in sports. It happens in everyday life where we may or may not recognize those gestures. It's always been a bit awkward when someone stands too close to you, right? But if you're having a conversation with someone across the room, they might seem distant or not really into the conversation, and oftentimes you're screaming, right? When we like someone, we're more open to things like a warm handshake or a friendly arm around the shoulder. But if we find someone creepy, annoying, we don't want them to touch us at all. So, how do we know how close to stand with someone that we don't know well? Or when is it okay to touch them? Well, there's no right or wrong answer here. There are some norms and guidelines on how we use touch in personal space with our intentions, but that is obviously up to how close of a relationship you have with that person. Thank you guys so much.